Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Janet, for organising this and for inviting us. Really exciting to be talking with my colleague from America, Becky Haas, and we've got 45 minutes to talk about what is, essentially the work that we spend our lives doing. So I won't waffle on. I'll just get stuck into it and share my screen with you. So I've called this talk prevention. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Benjamin Franklin said that, and my paraphrase is, why more of the same won't work? The urgent case for systems change. So I will start my timer because I need to make sure that I stick to time. And I'm going to hand over to Becky once I've set the scene. So before we proceed, we should start by talking about adverse childhood experiences. So this is the origin of this kind of talk, I suppose. So in 1998, Vincent Fleet and Robert Ander presented this paper, and it basically was one of the biggest discoveries in public health, certainly in my lifetime. And they discovered a strong and proportionate link or relationship between childhood adversity and physical health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and social outcomes later in life. And it was pretty groundbreaking. But actually, they received a very lukewarm reception. So rather than being nominated for a Nobel Prize, they were pretty much ignored for quite a long time. Nobody wanted to hear that bad things happening to children during the period that they're growing up led to poor health and poor mental well-being. So it was a bit of a struggle for them to get this noticed. And it's only, I'd say, in the past few years that this has actually found its way into, policy and practice. And I think we're at the kind of up-ramp of this science manifesting itself into the real world. So forgive me while I just make sure that my phone doesn't lock itself whilst I'm trying to time my talk. So I'm assuming some knowledge, because we talked about this in the summer. I did 2 talks on this subject, but the gist of it is this: over the last 20 years since that study was published, many household surveys have been repeated, looking at the relationship between childhood adversity and later life outcomes. And they all find the same pattern across time, across socio-economic groups, in different countries. And the pattern's still the same. There's a strong and proportionate dose-response relationship between the amount of adversity someone experiences in childhood and their outcomes later on in life. Now, on an individual level, of course, resilience, social assets, relationships, all of those things can offset the impact of stress and adversity. But at a population level, the pattern's pretty stable. And what's really interesting is that in England, there was a study conducted in 2014. And again, it found the same things. Childhood adversity is really common, and it's proportionately linked to poorer outcomes later in life for the people that had adversity compared with the people who haven't experienced it. Nearly half the population in England experienced at least one ACE in that survey, and 1 in 10 people said they had 4 or more. So this isn't at all a kind of rare occurrence. This is something that affects most of us. The summary of all of that work over the last 20 years is that people with more adversity tend to have worse outcomes. They tend to have more chronic illness. They tend to experience more forms of cancer and heart disease. They tend to have more inflammatory conditions, more addiction, more mental health problems. They're more often the victim or perpetrator of violence. They're also more often involved in the criminal justice system. They use more healthcare resources, more emergency resources, and have more problems with education and time off work. So it's probably one of the single most important opportunities we've got for improving public health and well-being. So that's a very quick summary of a very big area. But we also know that, beyond those broad health outcomes, there's very specific research looking at the link between childhood adversity and mental health outcomes. And as you can see from this collection of meta-analysis, there's a very strong relationship between childhood trauma, childhood adversity, and poor mental health. And in some cases, in some areas like psychosis, we're confident it's a causal relationship, not just a proportionate and strong relationship. And I want to thank Philippe Varese from the University of Manchester for pulling this together. Not only that, we also know there's a strong link between many of the things that create problems in our society, many of the addictions, and childhood adversity. So we know that people who've not had a safe, stable, nurturing home environment are more likely to have attachment problems, more likely to have difficulties with self-regulation as a consequence of not having had an attuned caregiver. So if you don't have an attuned caregiver, a safe, stable, nurturing relationship, somebody who responds to your needs, you don't learn via co-regulation the ability to down-regulate your nervous system, to switch off your stress response. And that has to be learned. It has to be learned from an adult. And if you don't learn it, unfortunately, your brain develops in those early years to a point where you don't have that natural ability to self-soothe. That can lead people to struggle with compulsive behaviors, to struggle with addictions. And also, people who've not had that stable attachment experience, they struggle with the social world, feeling safe. They struggle with a lot of anxiety, often struggle with managing emotions. And ultimately, that makes life more difficult. And the other way of thinking about this is if people are in pain, emotional pain, because of things that have happened in the past, they try and seek comfort. They try and feel better. They sometimes self-medicate or use addictive behaviors to feel at ease, for at least for a short time. So many of the problems we're seeing, whether it's drugs or alcohol or food or gambling or smoking, many of these things are attempts in the short term for people to feel better. But actually, many of our attempts to deal with those symptoms, they ignore, many of our attempts ignore the cause. So we don't actually give people safer and better coping strategies. We don't actually help people alleviate the pain that they're in and help them connect their current distress with their past. Very often we just focus on the symptom, which is the behavior, the criminal behavior, or the addiction, or the gambling, or the alcohol dependence. And because of that, many of those attempts aren't successful. So part of the solution is helping people understand the impact of trauma on their lives, asking them why they're in pain, and helping them find safer and better coping strategies to go forward. So that's ultimately why this idea of trauma-informed care was put forward back in the early 2000s. And it was originated in mental health services, actually. So the idea was, if we can include all of this science into our service design, then we're probably going to have a better chance of helping people overcome the trauma they've been through. We might actually help people by not passing that trauma on intergenerationally to their families. And actually, we'll create an environment by doing this that is better suited to the needs of our staff and our service users. And if we include all of that science that we've got listed, attachment theories we've just mentioned, trauma theory, gender theory, psychology, neuroscience, social science, all of those things, if you bring those into the thoughtful design of your service, you've got a better chance of minimizing the chance that you're going to re-traumatize people, or further disempower people, or trigger off their past trauma, or put staff in a position where they can't help people because they're dealing with their own stuff. So trauma-informed service design and practice is really about incorporating that science in a way that leads to better outcomes for people and means that it's not transferred through the generations. One of the other principles is that trauma-informed practice should benefit all stakeholders. It's not just something we do as employers or staff or professionals to our clients. It's something it's an ethos that should be holistic. It should benefit all stakeholders. It should be from the top straight through every single layer of our organization. And it's also something where we would say, look, we need to hear the voice of the service user in this as well. This is not about us doing to other people. This is not about further disempowering people. It's about engaging and co-producing. So if you had a trauma-informed service or organization, you would see those ideas and principles from the top of the organization. You'd see it in the vision, in the mission, in the behavior of the executive team and the board. You'd see it in the strategic decisions that were being made. You'd see it in the way people were hired, the way people were inducted, the way people were brought into that culture of the organization. You'd also see that the organization would measure and incentivize the right things. So the things that really make the difference, like the therapeutic alliance, the quality of the connection between people, the well-being of staff, as well as, some of the other things that kind of drive change as well. But, you would see evidence of his thinking at every layer. In terms of the workforce, it's a bit more obvious. So you would make sure the health and wellbeing needs of the workforce are taken care of. You'd make sure they have good supervision. So we'd look after the people, looking after the people. You'd also make sure they have the right knowledge and skills to do their job with the people that they're working with from a trauma-informed perspective. And in addition to that, you would also make sure that the environment that people working in, delivering care in, was appropriate and safe, because we know that if people don't feel safe, they become less pro-social, they become less adaptive and less able to learn, less able to grow, less able to take on new information and opportunities. It becomes about you get into a survival brain situation and you close down. So if you don't feel safe, you can't learn, you can't thrive, you can't take on new learning. And you can't think about the needs of other people. So all of this benefits all stakeholders. And ultimately, in terms of care delivery, are we delivering care that re-traumatizes people? Are we delivering care that further makes people feel disempowered because the power differential is gross and out of balance? Are we giving people access to things that they actually need? Or are we just giving people things that we think they need? Are we giving people access to evidence-based interventions? So all of those things you would see. And in Oregon, for quite a long time now, they've had a set of practice standards that they measure their progress against in mental health services. In Alberta and Canada, they have a similar approach. They require certain things of providers, and they want evidence that organizations are trained and moving their services in this direction. So we need services and organizations to operate like this. But it also then sort of begs the question, well, okay, we want to mitigate further harm, we want to kind of help people recover, but what about prevention? And this is a real epiphany for me when I ended up in the NHS working as clinical director for children and family services. It was a bit of a mind-blowing experience because I went from being a therapist and a service leader to being responsible for public health type services like health visiting. And I spent time with health visitors, and it was like, oh my God. So I've spent all these years trying to work out more and better therapies for people with psychosis and trauma. And actually the solution isn't more and better therapies. Probably the solution is probably give people access to the things we've already got, and let's prevent this poor health from happening, this poor mental well-being from happening, by making sure these babies and these families that I'm seeing have the best start, have the resources to live, to bring their children up the best way they can, have a safe place to live. So it was at that point that I realized the solution's not more and better technology. Actually, we have a lot of that already. The solution is moving upstream. So I'll give you Desmond Tutu, as I did last time. He says there comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So in terms of what's possible, there's a whole load of this literature, but in 20 minutes, I've got to choose carefully. So I'm going to share this one with you. This was a calculation from the English ACE study in 2014. Mark Bellis and Karen Hughes did this. And they calculated if we could prevent ACEs affecting the health and well-being of the next generation, we would see a reduction in health harming behaviours. We would see almost 40% reduction in unintended teenage pregnancy. We'd see a reduction in binge drinking and smoking and poor diet. We would see almost 60% reduction in crack and heroin use over a lifetime. We'd see half as many people being either the victim or perpetrator of violence, and half as many people going to prison. So the prize, the goal, the dream that we're aiming for is absolutely huge. But the question is, how do you get to that point? Because currently we're at a point where we spend a vast majority of our resources picking up the pieces, dealing with illness and crime and the social problems caused by some of these issues that are presented. Well, the first thing to say is, unless you see the possibilities, unless you understand that something's possible, you can't imagine it. So one of the things I often do with partnerships is say, okay, what do you think prevention means? Do you think it's even possible? And that's a really important starting point, because if you're a specialist working in a particular sector, you get really good at treating a problem or dealing with a particular issue. And very rarely do you get a chance to step back and look at the bigger picture and ask yourself the question, why is this happening? And is it possible to stop it? So when you look at the evidence reviews, there are a lot of them. There's some on the screen there. There are other ones. The Early Intervention Foundation present the best evidence on their website as well. There are lots of other papers, but I just picked a couple out. The Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, Public Health Wales. There are quite a few, but they all say the same things. They all basically say that we have enough evidence to be confident that if we were able to convene cross-sector commitment over the long term, we do have the understanding and the technical know-how, and we have the evidence to know that prevention is entirely possible. And they suggest that we should focus on 4 areas. So the idea is, if we had a public health approach to this problem, we would focus very much on the early years, we would focus very much on primary prevention, and we can prevent adversity in many cases. We also would spend a significant amount of our time and resources on supporting child and family wellbeing, and particularly in parenting programs. We get better at detecting and mitigating the impact of ACEs. So part of that's asking people what happened to them, rather than trying to identify what's wrong with people. And once you start asking, and I talked last time about the REACH model, about asking people routinely about adversity as part of an assessment, we still don't do that routinely in services. And if we ask people, they tend to tell us. And when they tell us, we can tend to give them a better offer, a better care plan, a better, a better intervention, if you like, than not knowing. And these reviews also suggest that there's a lot more we can do in the field of resilience to help people offset the impact of stress and adversity in their lives, to weather that storm much better. Things like youth work, mentoring, having safe adults in your life, regular access to sport, feeling connected to your community. These are all things that we can engineer into people's lives. And we can teach skills for coping much better than we are currently. We can help children know their rights from an early age, for example. So there's a whole load of things we can do. One example I'm really keen on is the idea of parenting programs. So we know that when they're targeted, they can still be very effective, but often people feel stigmatized by being offered them. There's several studies like this, but this one was in South Carolina. And when they offered Triple P parenting program as a universal offer to all parents, irrespective of the age of their children, at the 2-year point, they found a 23.5% decrease in child maltreatment. And this was at a time when it was increasing in other areas. They also saw 9.1% of decrease in children being removed from home, and a 10.5% decrease in non-accidental injuries. So they reduced child abuse in their state at a time it was going up in other areas by almost a quarter. And they saved $9 for every dollar they spent. So there are reams of these studies in those documents that I mentioned. There's a lot of evidence out there. The only question is why we're not implementing these things in a more widespread way. So you could conceptualize the challenge, if you like, as, well, where do we sit against that evidence in our area? On this continuum of prevention, what have we got and what's missing? Let's do a gap analysis against the evidence. Well, yeah, that would be an interesting place to start. That would be a great way of thinking about it. So you could use that way of thinking. But then you could also ask yourself, well, do we focus on the individual? Do we focus on family or the community? Or is it a bigger social thing? And if it is, then where do we start? And people start to feel a bit overwhelmed. So when I work with partnerships and strategic boards, I very often start with why. So if many of you will have read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, it's really powerful. And the idea being, if you don't get people to care about this stuff, if you don't give people a vision or a dream that they can get behind, you'll struggle. Ultimately, most organizations can tell you what they do and they can tell you how they do it. But the really great ones can tell you why they do it. So it's the old legend of JFK going to visit NASA and meeting the guy sweeping the floor. And he said, "What do you do here?" And he said, "Well, I help put people on the moon." And that whole idea is that the vision's so co-owned by everybody, that everybody knows their contribution to it. Similarly, Simon Sinek talks about Martin Luther King's famous speech in Washington, where he talks about having a dream, his famous I Have a Dream speech. And there's a reason why that was a dream that he shared about racial equality in the future, about his children being able to play with his children being able to play with white children, and to be judged by the color, not by the color of the skin, but by the content of the character. And that was the point where that speech turned. That's when everyone got behind him, when he shared his dream. So that's a really good place to start. Then you got to ask yourself, how do you ensure co-production for these visions and solutions? How do we ensure racial and social inequalities? How do we make sure they're addressed and it's a prominent part of our vision? And then the fourth thing I ask is, how do you ensure for your leadership this is a long-term cross-sector commitment to this shared vision, not something that's going to fizzle out when I retire or fizzle out when this CEO goes to a different job. This has to be a legacy. This has to be, a generational vision. It has to go beyond any one person. And then finally, I ask that we get together a group of leaders, because this can't be 10 CEOs trying to make this happen. This has to be distributed leadership. So you get a load of people in a room across a partnership, and we say, okay, go into separate groups, talk about each of these layers of possibility. These are ideas driven from evidence on system change, my experience of working in roles where system change is a big part of it. And ultimately, you got to start with asking the question, how do we engage with our community? How do we empower them? How do we communicate? How do we build assets? How do we support and train and engage our workforce? How do we give them the right knowledge and skills? How do we use commissioning to drive reform? Because I've seen that happen. I've seen change happen much quicker through commissioning reform than waiting for, the political winds to change. And then, it sounds boring, but one of the really important part of this is governance. How do you tie together all these different partners and sectors around a shared plan, a shared vision, with shared goals, shared accountability, and potentially shared budgets? How do you keep that going? And then, of course, look at the investment in prevention. Have we got trauma-sensitive schools? Do we have schools that equally balance academic attainment with well-being? Is our antenatal offer adequate? Does it bring into the idea of ACEs and parenting? Do we have parenting programs? Is that something that we're making the best of? And are we using opportunities to build resilience? Because, in a lot of places, mentoring is rare, youth work's rare, children's centres is rare. You've got to think about what we've got versus what we know the evidence tells us. And similarly for evidence-based interventions, we have a lot of knowledge and evidence about what works for people affected by trauma, but most people can't access them. And they also provide a really good return on investment. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. And I'm going to I'll leave you the words of Arthur Ashe first. So Arthur Ashe is quite an inspirational character. And very often when you think about system change, you kind of feel a bit overwhelmed. Sometimes you kind of feel, I honestly don't know where to start. This is just too big, too complicated, and we're all really busy. So I always look to the words of Arthur Ashe. And he said, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Becky, who's going to give you some great examples of what's been achieved so far in her part of the world. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, good afternoon. That was a great presentation, Warren. I'm really delighted to join this distinguished group of professionals today. I want to thank Janet and Chris and Kieran for your hospitality and the opportunity to present. Because we are limited in our time, I'm going to just go ahead and jump in and begin to tell you the story of what happened here. And Warren has done a great job laying a foundation of the science and some system approaches And the reason I think he and I connected back in 2019 was we really share very much the same philosophy of how this work can move forward. So I'm located in Northeast Tennessee. I'm very close to the state of Virginia, as well as the state of North Carolina. And I first learned about this topic while working for police. In 2014, my job at the police department, I managed a very large grant that was to develop prevention programs to reduce drug-related and violent crime. And as a result of the work, I ended up getting 19 police programs put together that 35 different organizations did. One of the programs that we were tasked with, along with reducing the community drug-related and violent crime in 2 neighborhoods where historically these types of crimes were predominant, was also to create a prevention and intervention to reduce recidivism. In Tennessee, the recidivism rate is within 1 to 3 years after a felony offender, which would be a more serious class of crime, is released from prison, they return to prison because of committing new crime. In California, the last time I checked, the rate is 77%. So prison overcrowding is something very serious and something very expensive and challenges to every community in the states. So in that journey, I learned about the ACEs study. The chief of police where I worked had asked me to write another grant for a domestic violence program. Tennessee, sadly, is ranked about 3rd of the 50 states where domestic violence is a challenge. So I attended a conference in 2014 and heard Dr. Folletti speak. And I just sat there and I think my mouth fell open when I heard him say that a man who scores a 6 on an ACE study has a 4,600% increase, or a 46 times increase of becoming an IV drug user, instead of compared to a gentleman who would say none of that happened. And I wondered why this was not a part of the conversation. And so again, I think one of the things that really helped to ignite our work and propel it forward was I already had, as Warren described, these different systems at the table. I had a monthly crime prevention partner meeting where the leaders of these 35 different community stakeholder groups were coming together. And it was everything from our library to probation and parole, the correction, the judicial, policing, our government housing, community gardens, food service programs. So we already had a real blend at the table. So before I breathed the word to anyone about what I was hearing and the thoughts that were going through my mind, I pulled out of the shelf a large binder and I put a cover on it, said trauma-informed system of care. I'd never even heard those words before. And I filled it with tabs of all the organizations that sat around the table in my crime prevention meetings. And I really did not know what I was going to find when I began to research. So really where my name is known in the States, as well as now doing some international work, is as a practitioner. I believed the science when I heard it. It was very compelling that we needed to look at childhood and the children growing up, because you reason that no one picks where they start in life. And now I'm working in the jails, working to build this program to reduce recidivism. And I hear stories of individuals who their whole life was growing up in a home with a caregiver, addicted, and they're being violated at an early age by people that frequent the home around the drug activity. And so I really had no idea when I created my notebook what I was going to find. But after a few months, I filled the notebook so full I couldn't shut it. And then I was convinced there was a meaningful application of resilience science, of the ACEs study, and trauma-informed care in any setting. And so at the same time, an organization, a federal organization called the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. They issued a concept paper on the guidance of a trauma-informed approach. And one small snippet from that concept paper was that communities should address trauma through a multi-agency public health approach, inclusive of public education, awareness, prevention, early identification, and then effective trauma-specific assessment and treatment. And so in 2015, I took my huge notebook and I thought, this is education. I need educators. Who would listen to this, crime prevention person from the police? So I went to our state university, East Tennessee State University, and I had a meeting with several department chairs. I asked a longtime friend and a tenured psychology professor to come along, and I presented my case and I shared about the ACEs study and how we needed to begin to educate cross sectors of professionals. And after that, the faculty members were quite polite and felt that it was something to be considered. But at that point, no one felt that they should engage in my work. And so my friend that I brought along, she told me 2 days later that she felt that this was something very impactful. So a few months later, we contacted SAMHSA, who had just written a course. My copy still has draft watermarked on it, of how to take a trauma-informed approach to an organization. So I'm a training developer. Much all of my career has been in training development and delivery of training and systems change. So I shortened that course. We felt like 8 hours was a bit much for professionals. So I shortened it to 4 hours. We began our first training in the spring of 2016. And we did this doing our regular jobs. Our supervisors, it was not a part of our job description. We had no funding, but we felt that passionate about this work and this message needed to get out. And then we also followed up after we began to do training with what we called our system of care. So once we began to train professionals, we had a subsequent meeting where we said, now, if you receive training in your organization, then send someone to come back to this meeting every other month to carry on the conversation. And then in 3 years, after over 100 trainings, some film screenings, community talks, train the trainer, which I also wrote to begin to put more trainers in place. We had trained over 4,000 professionals in our community in 40 different organizational systems. So then we wrote to SAMHSA and we asked if we could host a webinar in 2018 to meet the other cities and people that have been doing this work. And that's when we first learned something out of the ordinary had happened in Johnson City, Tennessee. We received a letter back from the director of the SAMHSA-funded Center for Trauma-Informed Care saying, though many communities across the nation are beginning to implement these recommendations, that we clearly stood out as a leader in embracing this model. And that was really the first time we had any idea that we had been doing some work that was not being done in every city across our nation. So immediately following that SAMHSA forum, we told our story to people from 20 states came, to governors' wives. It was sold out within days. Then I was offered a job to join a three-state health system, a very large healthcare company, as their first ever trauma-informed administrator. And I worked for them for 18 months and I began to implement measures to help them raise awareness of the social determinant of ACEs. I developed training for healthcare team members. This company owns 21 hospitals. I was successful in training one hospital all the way from the doctors to the cafeteria workers to the security guards. It was so inspirational for me because research shows that who patients talk to more than anyone is the housekeeping staff. And I remember in doing training sometimes late at night when the night shift came off, having the cardiologist sitting next to the housekeeper and how the housekeeper would just sit up so tall and realizing, as Warren gave the example in The Gentleman Helping to Put Someone on the Moon, how that everyone has a role to play. During my time working in healthcare, we began to expand outside of Northeast Tennessee into Southwest Virginia and to Western North Carolina. And then we began to provide trainings for community partners, including police. And in this healthcare footprint, there are 50 school districts. And I reasoned that if over time we wanted to improve the health, then we needed to reach the children younger. And so of those 50 districts, I was able to bring training to 8 of them. And then now, as a national and international speaker and consultant, when I'm working with other cities and now the nation of Lithuania to begin to embrace this, I bring about this thought pattern is that in the States, that some of our traditional approaches are not working. When I worked for police, I would sit in our local governmental meetings, and I would hear about the costs of building onto the prison. And then I moved to healthcare, and I would hear about the cost of building more floors on the children's hospital because of the amount of babies being born to an addicted caregiver. The healthcare system that I worked for, a typical county in the United States delivers 9 babies per 1,000 that are born to an addictive mother. But in some of the counties we served, one was 100 of 1,000 babies being born to an addicted mother. So 10% of the babies in that small rural area born into addiction. And so I saw these very costly things that seemed we needed some new approaches. And so I looked at prison studies and saw how much prison had grown by 500% in America to address drug crimes, but it wasn't winning. It wasn't winning. And then I began to see and serve.
Apologies, Becky. It was people joining. I've muted them.
Okay. So
apologies, Becky, I muted you by mistake. People were joining with their sound on. Sincere apologies for that.
Oh, okay. And then I saw in homelessness that the American Journal of Public Health said that the greatest sampling of population with high A scores were homeless individuals. And then in a subsequent study that Dr. Folletti and Anda did following the ACEs study was they saw that there was a reduction in doctor visits and emergency room visits when people were allowed to talk to their caregivers about some of the other things involved in their lives. And really quickly, because I know our time is very limited, to just show you what began to happen. So trauma is not an excuse. You know, remember now I'm in the justice field, so we wanted to still, to indicate that we are going to keep the laws. There are consequences when we choose addiction to self-medicate, but now we needed to involve trauma-informed in some of our healing interventions. So ACEs are fact, but they're not fate. And now it gave us an upstream approach. And so I thought of it as how about 25 years ago, they began to place AEDs, which are life-saving medical equipment in train stations, in the airport, in the mall, the shopping mall. And the key to these health devices saving lives is by training individuals. And so we could train people in how that those that are experiencing childhood trauma, that they don't have healthy support in the home, how that we could begin to remedy that by training professionals in our community. And so in getting started, I think one of the things that made our area stand out, and now as I do speak across the nation, there are a lot of people that know about this, but I think our approach was helpful in that we kept the message very simple. We kept it urgent, and we gave people, as they were trained, an expectation of doing something with this when you learned it. So in 2016, after we had been training for about a year, the state of Tennessee, under our governor we had then, they became interested in this topic and wanted to be a front runner in becoming a trauma-informed state. And so they even set up a funding system, and we applied for a small grant and got it. And we wrote a toolkit about our work, and which now has gone around the world on how to advocate, educate, and collaborate with systems to become a trauma-informed community. So I'm going to wrap this up very quickly just to show you the diversity of what happened in our region. And the beauty of this was, I like creating my notebook, is I didn't really know what I was going to find, if there were meaningful applications. But as you begin to educate professionals in your communities and cities, you're going to find the people that we call the boots on the ground, or the individuals that are in those services, then begin to have a trauma-informed lens. And now they begin to look through their services through that lens, and what could we do to help people heal and not re-traumatize? So some of our after-school programs, I know I'm on the board of one of them, and we used to have a list of children that could not return because of bad behavior, but now instead they have calming rooms, and they know kids' behavior is not willful, but it's survival. And some of our libraries started mindfulness coloring. Some of our state foster care began to create an intervention of a home called Isaiah 117, which is a faith-based nonprofit. And these have taken off all across the state, that when children are transitioning into foster care, instead of being in a cold office of the social worker, which is doing the best they can, now they're brought into a home where there's food and clothing and a bath to take. Also, some of our government housing, we trained the maintenance, we trained all the staff, and they begin to take on more of a warm approach. In one of our park and rec with coaches and our anti-drug coalition, they begin to do triple P parenting classes. They also raise some money because they noticed that 12 and 13-year-olds hanging out at the park always had a 2-year-old with them. And they realized these young teenagers are literally raising their siblings. And so they were able to raise some donations for young children, these young teens, to get what we call safe sitter class. We also began to create trauma-sensitive schools. So when I trained in healthcare, I trained literally hundreds of educators in a room at time. And then we began to see them create trauma-sensitive classrooms and sensory hallways. We started seeing students that wanted a laundry program, because now, instead of bullying their peers, they realize that at home no one is doing the laundry. And so they raised donations and brought in and created a clothes closet and run a laundry service. And students reorganized and decorated a counseling room because the counselor was meeting in a mop closet. And then we see many schools, Harry, out on the playground. They begin to put in some ways to resolve conflict in a game form. We began to see mindfulness coming into the principal's office and making the headlines in the paper. And then I began to write trainings for police as well, because I saw how many times police are the intervention. There's a program in the States called Handle with Care. I'm actually now working with the Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police, where we're rolling out the Handle with Care program statewide, all 95 counties in Tennessee, where police and schools are partnering together when police are on scene and children are present. If it's a traumatizing situation like a car crash, arresting a parent, violence in the home, addiction in the home, then the police notify the school with the simple words, handle with care. And then we begin to see in juvenile justice, where after training 3 courts, including the judges, some of the courts begin to add a therapy dog. And then I trained the staff in the juvenile detention center. And then also our domestic violence programs, we begin to see people coming into shelters with just the clothes on their back. So they reached out to the faith community that created these little blessing bags. And then in our community healthcare, we begin to see a cancer research clinic for children change up the pain protocol, because they didn't want to be restraining little children and holding them down anymore to be able to insert a port. They started having life skill classes for kids who had been in chemo and never been to preschool, and now it's time to go to kindergarten and they're healthy enough they can go. And so these marvelous health workers begin to do these classes to help kids get ready for school. And then in our faith community, we begin to see how that many faith communities throughout the region took an interest in this topic. And then we begin to see also how that workforce solutions, one of our city leaders, a former mayor and city councilwoman of 22 years, she launched a pilot that part of the EAP program in the human resource is that there is no shaming and no blaming, and they have a community navigator that staff can come and talk to when they might be behind on their rent or might lack the money for some food because they've had an unexpected health bill. And so this navigator helps connect them to the resources that already exist in the town, and so that they're able to maintain their employment. And so, as Warren said in kind of a different way, one of the things we've learned here and that we're building when I'm working with organizations or communities is typically in the States, when there was a trauma involved, we went right to the bottom of this pyramid, that there was an immediate recognition that behavioral health resources were needed and clinical resources. But now, through a trauma-informed approach, we see that more healing can begin to happen in creating trauma-informed communities. And in trainings that I give, I talk about stories that are so inspirational that I've collected through the years, of where a school bus driver helped a young girl navigate after her mother passed away, or different stories with physicians, just all around the community wellness and becoming a more resilient community, and by offering our services without re-traumatizing. And then the middle layer, where we recognize the benefit of our social work, our case management, our navigators, because we know from the science, when someone's life is overwhelmed with trauma, they have not developed the reasoning part of their brain. They've developed the survival part of their brain. And sometimes information has to be repeated, or maybe walking someone through filling out an application. So as we begin to expand those services, then we see healing take place there. And then we see the need for clear access to behavioral health. So we're working to utilize all of this around trauma-informed care. So here's at the end. So in 4 years, in June of 2020, actually in January of last year, 2020, the healthcare CEO called me to his office, and he asked me and the chief medical officer if we would reach out to East Tennessee State University and begin a conversation on co-founding a Strong Brain Institute. And in March of last year, the healthcare system gave $1 million gift over 5 years to ETSU to found the Strong Brain Institute. And this is a front page of on one of our local newspapers last year, not only on the front page, but the headlines. And so what I want to encourage all those that are joining today was how that in 4 years, by advocating, educating, and collaborating, we have now seen regional acceptance. Oh yes, we still have work to do, but in our community, it's regionally embraced that there's a social determinant of health to children that are growing up in toxic homes. And so my last slide is a quote I love from Helen Keller that says, "Though all the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming." Thank you.
Great. Thank you ever so much for those presentations. So I'm Chris Fox. I'm going to be taking forward the Q&A. So you may want to stop sharing your screen now, Becky, and then I'll make it easier for people to see your face. So thanks very much for the questions that have been coming through. What I've tried to do is group questions together. So I'm not necessarily going through them in the order they're in the chat bar, but I'm trying to cover as many as I can. And if you carry on sending in questions, I'll try to also cover as many of those as I can as well, possibly with a bit of help from Kieran to keep an eye on what's happening. I wonder if I could start off with some questions about our understanding of adverse child experiences. There have been several questions about how we recognize and identify adverse child experiences and understand them. So Sharon Kirk from MTC London asks, whilst a high ACE score may indicate a likelihood of difficulties, is it not also dependent on protective characteristics? There's also been a bit of a discussion going on, which Warren's already contributed to on the chat, around reach, and the sort of point coming out. One of the points coming out of that was the idea that someone can have one ace, and that can impact them as profoundly, if not more, than someone who has several aces, and therefore how important is scoring versus a dialogue with people. There's then a question, I think, coming from Barry Flanagan at Recycling Lives about the need to engage different agencies in identifying people with adverse childhood experiences, and that being important to promoting prevention. So maybe we could start with that little group of questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for those questions. Becky, is it all right if I kick off and then
Sure.
hand over to you for your thoughts on this? I completely agree, and obviously we didn't have much time to talk about what is a massive subject. So in the first series of talks I did for the Academy, I talked a lot about adversity, and I kind of had more time to expand on the fact that I see a kind of set of balancing scales with adversity on one side and resilience factors and coping assets on the other side. And it's all about helping people understand and deal with trauma and adversity, but at the same time, fully acknowledging what resources and assets they've got, because you're absolutely right. Somebody could have all 10 of those things and more and still be living a thoroughly productive and fulfilling life, because they've had those safe adults in life. They've had those opportunities to feel a sense of belonging, to feel that they mattered, to have a sense of connection to a community or a group. We know that if people have those kinds of assets in their life at the time when difficult things are happening, they can come out of that, I wouldn't say unscared, but people can overcome adversity by having strong sources of resilience and social support. And those things can be acquired across the life course. They're not necessarily things we're born with, other than obviously if you're fortunate enough to have solid and reliable attachment relationships and well-attuned caregivers and a safe home environment. I mean, that really helps. But resilience is a relationship. Adversity and resilience have a relationship, and one thing can offset the other. So it doesn't mean because you've been through things that you're not going to have good health and good relationships. As far as reach is concerned, I put in routine inquiry about adversity in childhood was the model that I developed a few years ago. That all came about because it became very clear to me that pretty much everybody I saw had a history of trauma. And the team that I worked with at the time, the first episode psychosis team, agreed with that and said, let's find a way of making this a routine part of our assessment. It's not at all about scoring. The score is irrelevant. One experience can be just as devastating in someone's life as 10 experiences. It's not about that. The approach that I advocate is about saying, if someone's asking our help, let's ask them what's happened to them in their life, because we know it has an impact on their well-being. So it's a very simple concept, but the reach training was based on my experience and the science that says if you don't ask people what happened, they tend not to tell you. If you don't help people by inviting a safe conversation, they'll keep a lid on it. They'll potentially keep believing that it was their fault. They'll feel that shame and that guilt, and we know that's harmful for your health. Whereas if you give someone the opportunity to talk about their experiences in the context of their health or the condition they're bringing or the problem they're bringing, they tend to join the dots. And you've then got an opportunity to say to somebody, thank you for sharing that with me. I believe you. That was really brave. And by the way, what you've just told me wasn't your fault. And do you need any help with it? And is that thing you just told me still happening? So by having a simple conversation and giving someone the opportunity to talk to them, to talk to you about potentially their deepest, darkest secrets, you have the opportunity for them to start on a different direction. So that's where the whole idea of reach came from. And I'll stop there because I know I could ramble on all day, but I'll give Becky the chance to add her thoughts to this.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Yes, good questions. So in the trainings that I've done now, and training literally thousands of professionals, as we explain about ACEs, we never say in the training that you must begin to screen or what we do is we talk about what the screening, like the work Warren's done through REACH, but we also talk about using a universal precaution approach. And when you look at national numbers in the states, 1 of 4 girls, 1 of 6 boys on a national level have been abused in some fashion before the age of 18, and the amount of women and domestic. And so the numbers are very, very high. And so when I'm training hundreds of educators, what my goal is instead of having to know the story of every child, we want to help educators build skills to deal with the lingering effect of that trauma. And that's one of the things we're doing at the Strong Brain Institute is instead of having to catch up our professionals and learning about trauma behaviors, now we're wanting to embed it in their education, their professional education as they're going off to college and university. And so then the same with police. Some of the police often feel that sexual assault reporting is false, but that's because police don't understand that trauma behavior would be in line with delayed reporting. Delayed reporting would be or a female to isolate or a male or somehow that the violence occurred. Trauma behavior would further strengthen and corroborate the case. So we present it in a way where it's up to the organization if they want to begin to do their screening, but yet for all to begin a universal approach.
Great. Thanks very much. Right, I'm going to sort of move through some questions now that take us from maybe a deeper understanding of the approach to then thinking about some system-wide implementation issues. So sort of continuing with the understanding of the approach, Justine Leyland asked, how much do we understand about the intersection of trauma and inequalities? And she's thinking about overrepresentation of Black minority ethnic children in the youth justice system and how trauma and discrimination interact. So could we have a quick think about that one next, please?
Absolutely. Becky, do you want to go first this time?
Okay. Would you read the question again, Chris? Make sure
But really the link between or the intersection between trauma and inequalities. So certainly, I think in the UK and the US, very clear overlaps between overrepresentation in the criminal justice system and people from Black minority ethnic groups, and how we understand that in the context of trauma-informed approaches.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I believe Warren had the slide of a pair of ACEs, which comes from the George Washington Public Health Department. And in that, what the faculty came up with in that graphic is when our communities may be underserved in some way, a lack of safe housing or food scarcity, safe parks, maybe the schools are not as well funded. And if you think about that as the soil, then the soil is likely then to grow fruit that is not going to be, that could consist of extreme poverty or addiction in the home, lack of employment opportunities. So what we begin to do in a lot of trainings now is I talk about that people need to know that how to have personal protective factors by having a support system, you know, whatever that may all look like, but also community protective factors. And so I'm on a board of an after-school program called Boys and Girls Club. And at the Boys and Girls Club, we're going to have 8 weeks of what we call family engagement. And many of these families, to have an extra class at night, would need childcare, would need extra transportation. So we've worked out free childcare there at the center. And I'm bringing in financial literacy. I'm bringing in how to do a better resume. We're going to practice jobs interviewing and some of the things that could help enrich our families all at one location. So I think what we see in trauma-informed approach is that every neighborhood, respective of what ethnicity or demographic, we must surround our communities with these community protective factors. And then I think that when there's dysfunction in the home, then we're going to see mentors come along, opportunities come along with children being lifted up and encouraged through other relationships. And I think we're going to see those numbers go down. But I think a lot of it's been just unaware of the fact how community needs to come together.
That's a great response, Becky. I'm hearing a terrible feedback actually at my end. I'll try again. We know that social inequalities and racial inequalities and poverty and multiple disadvantage all increase stress on families. And when families are under huge amounts of stress, they struggle then to be available for their kids. They struggle to meet the needs of their children, and and that cuts across boundaries and kind of all sectors of society. But that pair of aces study that Becky referred to, that we can send on to you afterwards, that showed basically that living in an environment where there's violence, living in an environment where there's lack of social cohesion, being poor, not having social opportunities, not having decent housing, not having a chance for a decent job and education, facing prejudice, facing racism, all of those things make life much harder for families to raise their children in the best way possible. It puts enormous amounts of stress on people. So it absolutely is related. Yeah, of course. This is a social problem, not just a problem of fixing what happens in the home.
Great, thanks. We had various questions and comments through the chat during your talk, where I think people were trying to situate the approaches you're talking about in relation to other things happening in the systems they work in. So we had a couple of people interested in the relationship between trauma-informed work and strengths-based or asset-based approaches. A comment from Khaleesi UK, and then from Nigel Rose, not sure which organisation he was from, both asking around the sort of issues around the link with strengths-based work. And Nigel was also interested in the risk of labelling or stigmatizing people by focusing too much on their adverse childhood experiences and the negative potential impacts, and how that might counter strengths-based work. We then also had a couple of questions about other approaches that might or might not fit with this broad approach. So Catherine Donnelly was asking about EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Is that an intervention, an approach that might fit? And then we had question Justin, about the potential for sort of intergenerational interventions and approaches, whole family trauma-informed approaches, and how they might fit. So would you be able to say a little bit about how the approach fits in with some of those different areas?
Yes. Is it all right if I take the labelling question, Becky?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And the strength-based, go ahead. Okay.
So I think the whole thing with talking to people about what's happened in their lives, I don't see as a labelling approach. I think what happens a lot in our system is that people are offered a diagnosis. We try and find a shorthand version of what's wrong with them. So we try and work out what's wrong with them. It's a very pathological approach. And what we don't do is, once people have got a label or a diagnosis, we kind of stop asking questions. We stop asking what's happened in this person's life for this to be their reality, this to be their circumstance. So I think a trauma-informed approach is very strengths-based. I think it is actually the opposite of labeling people, because I think it's about saying what's happened to you in your life, and does what you're dealing with now have some bearing on what you've been through. I actually think it engenders a lot of compassion, both from the work but also for the client, because you're saying, well, given what you've been through in your life, it kind of makes sense that you're struggling with this, this, and this. That makes perfect sense to me. You've had some real challenges, but you've survived. However, what you've not had is the benefit of, the ability to learn to cope with stress without using alcohol or drugs, or you struggle to manage your emotions when you feel frustrated. So for me, it's about normalizing and saying lots of people have been through these things. It does affect your emotional health. It does affect your physical health. But actually, by recognizing that there's a relationship between what you've been through in the past and what you're dealing with now, that puts us in a much better position. That puts us in a much stronger position to try and assist and help you, if that's what you want. So I think it's a very helpful and normalizing approach. It's not at all about scoring anybody and saying this number of aces means this. That's absolutely not what I'm about. And in relation to EMDR, I think it's an evidence-based intervention that helps people with trauma. Fantastic. CBT, trauma-focused CBT, is an evidence-based intervention that helps people with trauma. Not everybody needs that. A small percentage of people will absolutely need those interventions once they've started to talk about their past trauma. And the problem is most people can't get access to them. That's the problem. So I think we have a lot of really powerful interventions that we know are effective. The problem is it's a lottery whether you get access to those things. All the time, people are struggling to survive, struggling to function, maybe using drugs to self-medicate, maybe having problems in their relationships, maybe getting divorced, and then the children that they've got are affected. So it's short-sighted not providing evidence-based interventions that we know are absolutely cost-effective, and leaving it to chance for people. So they're the two things that felt obvious for me to respond to, Becky. I don't know if you want to talk about intergenerational issues or strengths-based approach.
Well, I'll just add to that, Warren, is to me one of the professional sectors that and working with the populations that seemed so grateful for this message was in the justice system, because individuals in the justice system, and mostly it's for drug addiction here in the United States, in the area I work in, about 70% of the crime, it's around drug addiction. And so when the inmates or those incarcerated were hearing that they were not born a bad person, but what trauma can begin to do in your life. Now, yes, we are responsible for our choosing, consequences for choosing poor health, poor coping mechanisms, which in that case could be drug addiction. And then often crime is going to be coming along to support that addiction. But when they hear, I've had people in the jail say this was the best day of my life, because they see now they weren't born a bad person, but it was their trauma. And so by beginning to bring this conversation into the settings, I saw someone brought up on the chat that it's not about just listening to find out what solution can we do, but just active listening to realize that someone suffered something, very that no child should have ever been born into a home with a heroin addicted mother, and her mother leaving weeks at a time. A true story with having to care for, at 8 years old, having to care for a 4-week-old baby sister. And when I worked for police and said that day to the woman, there's counseling in this program, and I'm so sorry that happened. It just began to break over the barriers, and it's just people realizing that sometimes there's a lot of hardship around us, and how can, through the kindness, we began to lift others up. And a lot of that is very much intergenerational. Just because people are having children, it does not mean they were parented. So by Triple P and rolling out parenting academies in some unusual places like libraries and state housing, where there can be some free childcare, we're helping to strengthen our families to break those cycles.
Can I just add one thing to that, please, Chris and Becky? I just thought of where all this started for me, which was we started doing this work in Blackburn, where my early intervention team was based, and we developed the training, then we offered it to the family support team of the local authority. And what we saw when we trained the family support workers to ask the parents they were working with about their life adversity was that they reflected on their own experience of growing up. They reflected on how they were parented. And they very often recognized that they were just repeating what their parents had done. And actually, sometimes they recognized that wasn't perhaps what they wanted or what they felt was best for their children. And it was at that point they started to ask for help. So you can actually help the person sat in front of you deal with their problems by talking about what they've been through. But also you can help them think about how they want to be parents and grandparents for their kids and for their family. And it does start people on a journey. It does start people reflecting on how they got here and how they've learned what they've learned. And sometimes it lets people realize that perhaps they've run out of ideas and they want better for the kids, and they start to ask for that help. So yeah, that's just come back to me.
Great. I've got a few more questions. I'm hoping that people are okay just to maybe stay on a moment or two past quarter past, but I'll try and keep questions quite brief. So some questions around sort of the more about the implementation, I guess, of the approach. We had a couple of questions and comments around staff. So a question from Becky Giles about why trauma-informed work is not part of the induction for staff working in the CJS. I think in that sense, as part of their training for how they work with people, but also making the point, and similar to a point made by another contributor, that of course this is an approach that might have an impact on staff because they might recognize that they are themselves or have experienced adverse childhood experiences, and so it might have an effect on them. And also by working with staff around these issues, it might improve the way staff work. So it's kind of two-edged issue there that I wonder if you could have a think about.
Okay, Warren, how about I'll start out
Yeah,
here?
go ahead, Becky, yeah.
Yeah, good questions. Okay, I've had experience in both of those fields, and in the fact of you want your workforce to understand trauma, but then you realize your workforce, there's a high likelihood 60 to 70% of your workforce are trauma survivors. There's no socioeconomic boundary to trauma. And so what my goal on one end in working with organizations in cities, there's a model called the Missouri model, and I lead workshops on that, where you move from trauma aware to trauma sensitive to trauma responsive to truly trauma informed, that you don't just hear a 45-minute workshop and then your group is trauma informed, but there are steps to take. And the last one, when truly being trauma informed, that is when your board members understand it, your literature, your job descriptions, when you're going to hire a new director, a new case manager, all this language is embedded in it. And that our new hire orientation, that's where I was going when I worked for the healthcare system, was working with human resource, that all the staff that was onboarded would get some orientation about trauma. But then the other side of that question, you never want in your presentations and your training, to trigger people. So as a trainer, you want to be very mindful of turning off the lights or loud noises. And the overarching rule to me of trauma-informed care is do no harm. And so when I lead a training, I always start my training by saying some of the content will be sensitive. We may hear our own story. And if you need to step out or get a drink of water, please feel free. And I, when I'm teaching detectives about sexual assault interviewing, I'm talking to them in the same way to do a trauma-informed interview, because some of the content in the conversation is going to be around hard and intimate things. And so they need to upfront begin to say, now, at no point do we want this training or this conversation to make you feel uncomfortable. So it's very good. You need to approach it from both sides.
Yeah, I agree completely, Becky, that when you're delivering training, you have to be sensitive to the fact that this is all of us, not just us and them, and also I think it should be I personally think this is an extension of our safeguarding responsibilities. If we know that more than half the people we're working with will have been affected by this, and for some of them it might still be happening, then it makes perfect sense to me, if someone's seeking my help as a professional, to ask them what's happened in their life. So that's the way I see it. So I think everybody who works in a helping organisation should have some basic training as part of their induction. I'm working with lots of organisations where this is becoming part of the induction across partnerships. So various areas in the UK where we've trained thousands of staff to have a basic understanding about this, so that they care about it. And then once they care about it, they can start to think about how it influences their practice. But the other thing we do, similar to what Becky's done, is we send people some information a few weeks before the training, so that people get a chance to think about how they react to this material, whether it's something that's unresolved for them, whether it's something that they might need help with themselves. So by doing this work and by saying to the workforce, this is all of us. If you're affected by this, we want to help you. If you're affected by this, you're not on your own. This is about making a more resilient workforce, as well as a more, offering a better service to the people we're trying to care for. So I think it entirely fits with this idea that trauma-informed practice should benefit all stakeholders, not just the recipients of the service.
Great, thanks. We still have over 200 people on the call, so I'm going to risk one more question before I hand back to Kieran to wrap up. So we have some questions from people who I think were enthused and inspired by what you've said, but also seeing the challenges of implementation in the systems they work in. So we had some questions about how we can accommodate or design these kind of approaches within sort of target-driven environments where there's a strong emphasis on cost effectiveness, the need for a sort of local systemic community approach, and how do we sort of roll that out in complex environments, and of course questions about how that fits in then with funding cuts and sort of potential austerity to come, and how that all then of course fits in with election cycles and the need for long-term thinking around these kind of ideas. So maybe you could have a final thought around some of those issues before we hand back to Kieran.
Yes. Well, I'll be brief on this, but this is a conversation that I always have with partnership groups when I first work with them. And the first question is, are you in this for the long haul? Do you see a vision for your locality, for the people who live here, that is beyond the next 4 years or 5 years? Do you see this as something you want to leave as a legacy? Because we're talking realistically 20 to 30 years to realize these transformations, these health benefits that we're talking about. And are you prepared to collaborate genuinely? And are you prepared to give away some of your leadership power and have a distributed model? Are you prepared to co-create with your community? So, and then the other thing I always say to people is, if not now, then when? Because things are getting worse, not better. You can argue for another year of transformational planning or strategic thinking, but things are not going to be any better. You have to start now. This is why I chose the Arthur Ashe quote, because you have to start where you are, use what you've got, and do what you can. And that's why the task model, I created it in the first place, because it gives people a starting point. This is the long term. It's not an overnight success. It's not a project. It's a cause. That's why Martin Luther King did his I Have a Dream speech, and not that I've got a 25-page business plan speech. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to ramble, but I'll leave it at that.
That's exactly why it's good to associate with you, Warren. We're on the same page. And I do agree. My last thoughts here is that we always say that trauma informed, it's a journey. It's not a process. And I know, watching over the last 30 years in America, both of my parents were chain smokers when I was a child. And I remember as a youth, them bringing home a carton of cigarettes and a warning label being there. And then our restaurants and different approaches begin to happen, where now even you can't have tobacco on a institutional property of a college, university, hospital. And that's taken some time. But to Warren's comment there, a few years ago in my state, there was a terrible car accident on the main interstate that comes through Tennessee. And it was on the news at night, and it was involving tractor trailers and several vehicles, and there were some fatalities, and it was fiery. And they interviewed a young man that was the first along the wreck before the first responders got there. And he was running from car to car, pulling victims out. And they were interviewing him as such a hero. And so in my mind, we're doing no harm by beginning to raise the amount of this conversation we're putting into our communities, because knowing that young man ran up to their car while it was on fire and he helped pull them to safety, none of them said, wait a minute, we're waiting for the fire department. Do you have a license? Are you a first responder? No, they were grateful that he showed up. And so if we train some bus drivers and cafeteria workers, and we're all on our way, and even the things that I shared with you today, we're really just out the gate, but we're on our way. So it is a process. But like Warren said, you have to make a commitment. Leadership has to make a commitment that it's going to be in our budget. It's going to be in our training, because those things are there now for race and equity trainings, for sexual harassment trainings, for tobacco, so we've done other things in social change. So this should be considered in that way.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, for answering those questions so fully. Back to Kieran to wrap up.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for that really interesting and engaging conversation. And you can really see how the links form between trauma-informed practice and criminal justice, how it ties into the biopsychosocial model, the HMPPS use, and the systems, which is the journey at the back end. But being church prerogative, I've got a quick question for you. And it was when Warren was talking, he mentioned the magic word, the P word, the prevention word. And quite often we deal with things after the fact. So how do you sell prevention, trauma-informed practice as a way to prevent first-time offending, because getting funding for prevention is hard work, because you have to prove that this thing will stop something that may or may not happen at some point in the future. Have you got any thoughts on the links between preventing first-time offending, trauma-informed care, and how we can sort of engage in the conversation around that?
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, I mean, I think we could be having the same conversation about offending or drug use or teenage pregnancies or, you know, poor physical health or addictions. I mean, these are all endpoints, and we can track them all back to adversity in childhood. And there's so much evidence that people who go into prison, people who are prolific offenders, people who go into prison at an earlier age, all are the people who have had the worst experiences in childhood. You know, they've lacked safe, stable, nurturing home environments. Very often they've been through traumatic experiences. They've been the victim of violence. They've experienced abuse. They've experienced domestic discord. You know, there's no surprise that when people end up in prison, they've had difficult lives. So it's just, I think we could be having the same conversation about any of those other social problems that we're dealing with. And we know that the origins of those difficulties are upstream. Unfortunately, though, I think when people go to prison or youth offending institution, they still don't come out better equipped to deal with their life circumstances than they started. And that's partly the problem. So I'll keep it brief and stop there. Becky, do you want to?
Well, I think you were spot on there, Warren, and just the fact that we need to, in educating parents in some untraditional ways, maybe in libraries, maybe in housing, and help the light come on to see that, they weren't parented themselves. And so no parent really wants to be a bad parent, but they don't realize they weren't parented themselves. And so I think the more the information gets out, the best case would be to prevent the abuse from ever happening. But now we know from the ACEs study what that abuse left unresolved could lead to. And we know now that positive childhood experiences or nurturing support and connection can actually be the cure. And so kind of working at it from every end.
Thank you, and thank you for a really engaging seminar. As we get to the end of our 90 minutes together, we still have 180 people on the call from a peak of, I'm sure you didn't look because it's a little bit terrifying, from a peak of about 330. So, lots to talk about, lots of feedback. So thank you very much. So if we just take this moment to thank Warren and to thank Becky for their presentation, to remind you that the presentation is available on the Academy of Social Justice website, with other presentations, including some others on trauma-informed practice and ACEs, which we recommend that you go and have a look at. And please do keep an eye out for upcoming events. Tell others that you might work with and colleagues and friends about this as well. And thank you for spending an hour and a half of your Wednesday, I suppose it's evening, I don't suppose it's afternoon, with us, and enjoy the rest of your night. Janet will contact you over the next couple of days with some feedback. Please do complete the feedback. It's really useful for not only for us in the Academy, but also for Warren and Becky, because we do pass that feedback on to them and they can pick up on that. And speaking of the devil, I'll pass it back to Janet.
Yes, thanks everybody, and just to say thank you very much again to Becky and Warren, and to Chris and Kieran also for chairing and co-chairing. Thank you very much. And the slides and the seminar recording, a link for that will be sent out to you tomorrow. So thank you very much everybody, enjoy your evening.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Bye.